Alison Gopnik, and I'm a professor of psychology and affiliate professor of philosophy at the University of California at Berkeley. It's probably sometime when I was about 2. I grew up in this crazy Bohemian family in Philadelphia, and we actually lived in a public housing project. So definitely one of my earliest memories is having my crazy Bohemian mother making strudel on the table in this public housing project, and having all of the children running around naked underneath the table eating the scraps from the strudel. So that was a fairly typical scene in our household growing up. Part of the reason why people got it so wrong about babies for so long was because as adults, when we want to find out what someone's thinking, we ask them and get them to tell us. And that's something that babies and even young children are very bad at doing. So to figure out what babies and young children think, we have to figure out ways to ask them in their language and not ours. So for infants, that means actually looking at what they do, where they look, what actions they perform, rather than what they say. And even for, say, the 3- and 4-year-olds that I study a lot, it means getting them to say choose between 2 alternatives, or actually do something, rather than, you ask a 3-year-old, what are you thinking? And you get this beautiful Blakean stream of consciousness monologue about their birthday party and horses and all sorts of things. So what we have to do is really rely on actions rather than words, get them to produce actions, and also give them information about the problem we are presenting in terms of real physical objects in their immediate environment. So, for example, we've been doing very exciting work about babies and young children's understanding of statistics. Well, even grown-ups, any grown-up who's taken a statistics class will tell you grown-ups are in fact, Danny Kahneman got the Nobel Prize for showing how bad grown-ups are at explicitly thinking about probabilities. But when we take 3-year-olds, fortunately, we would never do anything as lunatic as ask them about probabilities. But if we actually give them a real machine that operates according to probabilistic principles and just get them to operate the machine, then you suddenly realize, oh, wait a minute, they actually are implicitly understanding all of the things like, conditional probability. It's always a very big leap to go from any kind of science to clinical cases, because clinical cases are so complicated. But I do think there may be some evidence now that there's a kind of continuum between schizophrenia and, say, creativity. So, schizophrenia seems to be a kind of occupational hazard of poets, for instance. That there seems to be some connections between those things, and those seem to be connected with some of the neurological phenomena that we also see with very young babies. Essentially not having a lot of top-down control, not having, typically for the way the adult brain works, and the aspect of the adult brain that adults are most interested in, is that the prefrontal region, which is sort of the brain's head office, where the chief executives are, a lot of what goes on in adults is that it shuts down big, enormous other parts of the brain. One of the things that happens when you dream, for instance, is that kind of really ferocious control gets lifted. And there's a little evidence that, at least with some kinds of mental disorders and with adult creativity and in infancy, some of what's happening is that ferocious control is disappearing, which is a good thing for babies, not a good thing for adults who have to find their way around the world. It's always a very big leap to go from any kind of science to clinical cases, because clinical cases are so complicated. But I do think there may be some evidence now that there's a kind of continuum between schizophrenia and, say, creativity. So, schizophrenia seems to be a kind of occupational hazard of poets, for instance. That there seems to be some connections between those things, and those seem to be connected with some of the neurological phenomena that we also see with very young babies. Essentially not having a lot of top-down control, not having, typically for the way the adult brain works, and the aspect of the adult brain that adults are most interested in, is that the prefrontal region, which is sort of the brain's head office, where the chief executives are, a lot of what goes on in adults is that it shuts down big, enormous other parts of the brain. One of the things that happens when you dream, for instance, is that kind of really ferocious control gets lifted. And there's a little evidence that, at least with some kinds of mental disorders and with adult creativity and in infancy, some of what's happening is that ferocious control is disappearing, which is a good thing for babies, not a good thing for adults who have to find their way around the world. John Flavel, who was the great developmental psychologist, one of the greatest ones of the 20th century, said that he would, give everything that he possessed to have just 3 minutes inside of the head of a baby. And I feel that way too. The trouble is, I probably wouldn't be able to understand a lot of what they were saying, even if they could say it. So I think I'd want to ask them, what's it like? What are you seeing at this moment? How many things do you know about? What do you think about the adults around you? But my suspicion is that even if they could talk, probably part of the reason why they aren't talking yet is because what they would say would be in a language that I couldn't quite understand. Well, it seems as if there's a really big switch between about 5 and 6. And of course, it's funny because in our culture we say, we talk about that age group as preschoolers versus school-age children. Of course, school is a very recent invention. But if you look across lots of cultures, something happens around 6. So the babies say, will move from the mother's quarters to the children's quarters, or kids used to start becoming being apprentices when they were about 7. Sort of losing your first tooth seems to be a big marker of this transition. And I think what happens is that kind of transition, and of course it's, starting at 4 or 5 and then continuing, is really a transition from a creature that's mostly designed to do this very broad-based learning to a creature that's starting to develop the specific skills that are going to be important as an adult. So by the time you get to 7, 8, 9-year-olds, they can actually work. I mean, they can actually do things. They can actually do things that are productive and helpful. And they're starting to get those more narrow, maybe a thing to say, it's not just more narrow, but more specialized. So in some cultures, our culture really values a very, very narrow focus of attention. That's what we teach kids to do in school. In other cultures, what they'll do is teach kids to do things like shift attention from one thing to another very easily. The important thing is that in all cultures, you go from this early, very, very wide-ranging attention, which is like infants, to, and here's the attentional strategy that is important to do the things that you need to do in this culture. And sometimes it can be the narrow focus that we have in our culture, but in other cultures, as I say, it might be, if you're a hunter, for instance, it might be how to pay attention to lots of different things at once in order to hunt more effectively. Américain, what can we do to make them do it better? And I'm afraid I think the answer to it is pretty boring, which is have lots of caregivers around who love them a lot and have lots of stuff around for them to play with, and let them play without worrying too much about whether they're getting academic skills or they're making a mess. One of the things I say is, from an evolutionary point of view, probably the ideal rich environment for a baby includes more mud, livestock, and relatives than most of us could tolerate nowadays. But I think, some pigs, a lot of dirt, a bunch of uncles and cousins, that's probably a pretty good environment for babies to grow up in. But if you can't manage that, then a lot of cardboard boxes, bean plants, goldfish, the kinds of things you see, in fact, sandboxes, the kind of things you see in really great preschools. But when I say that, it sounds very boring and banal, but is one important thing. We know from the science that the thing that kids learn from most is other people, and particularly other people who are dedicated to taking care of them. And in most places and times in human history, babies have had not just one person, but lots of people around who were really paying attention to them, around, dedicated to them, cared to them, were related to them. And I think the big shift in our culture is the isolation in which many children are growing up. So in fact, if we really wanted to make babies smarter, what we would do is make sure that 20% of them aren't growing up in poverty, make sure that even middle-class parents aren't so insane because they're working so hard that they can't spend time with their kids, make sure that preschool workers are actually paid more than dog catchers. So the thing that's most important is having people who are involved and engaged with the kids and also are not stressed and can be involved with them. And that's actually not boring and banal. That actually takes a lot of work to make that happen. And it's not something that our society does very well at all. You know, I think the stuff that I study most, which is the babies and infants, that seems to be something that's so deeply built in that we see very great commonalities across cultures in that respect. It's interesting when you start thinking about the school age period. I think we have pretty good reason to believe that for most of human history, the way that babies and children made that transition was through a kind of process of apprenticeship. So the way that children learned the skills that they needed was they practiced them, they had other people around who corrected them, they saw people who were doing the things that were important, they could imitate them, they could practice a little bit, the people around them would say, yeah, you're doing that well or badly. And in fact, if you think about how we teach kids to cook, or how we teach kids to dance, or how we teach kids to play basketball, those are all examples where we still use those kinds of teaching techniques. Now, we don't do that typically in schools. So in schools, you know, children are not learning to write from people who are writers or by watching people who write. They're not learning how to do math from people who are mathematicians. There's this kind of weird special thing that we have, which is school, which is very different from the ways that I think human beings have ever learned before. Now, I don't want to be sentimental and romantic about the past. We're not teaching people to be hunter-gatherers. We're teaching them to have this wide range of skills, like being able to read and do mathematics and all sorts of other things. But it does raise a kind of dilemma about, I think it's interesting that children so often are so enthusiastic about, you know, something like basketball, even with these, you know, horrible, mean, you know, authoritarian coaches who are yelling at the kids all the time. But I think it's because the kids are kind of tuning into, oh, this is really a way that I can learn. One of the things that I say is, imagine if we taught baseball the way we teach science, right? So the first, all through school, what you would do is read about great baseball players. And then in college, you might get to actually replicate the occasional great baseball game, you know, and you'd have pitching drills where you just throw the same ball over and over and over again. And you'd never play the game until you got to graduate school. That's pretty much what happens with science, right? We don't actually play the game of science until we get to graduate school. And I think our, you know, baseball performance would be about like our science performance if that's what we did. I think there are a bunch of things that adults do that put them back functionally and sort of phenomenologically into the infant state. One thing is traveling. So going to a new place is an example of a situation in which you put yourself in the position of a baby. So if I go to Beijing for the first time, everything around me is brand new. Everything's different. I'm soaking up lots of information at once about everything going on. The doors and the tables and the way people look, and everything about the place is new. And I think what happens when you do that is that you actually gain consciousness. You know, you can go around essentially, you know, being the faculty meeting attending zombie for months and months and months. And then you go to Beijing and suddenly you're awake. So I think travel is one example. One of the things I say is I think, by the way, another example is caffeine. So caffeine actually seems to have some of the same kind of brain effects that I think are going on with the babies. So one of the things I say is you want to know what it's like to be a baby. It's like being in love for the first time in Paris after 4 double espressos. And boy, you are alive and conscious. Now, you also do wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning crying in that circumstance. So I think there's and you're likely to wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning crying when you go to Beijing for the first time. So I think there's a real trade-off between that extended consciousness and the genuinely valuable adult abilities of focus and planning and goal direction and automaticity. Certain kinds of meditation, actually, interestingly, what's sometimes called open awareness meditation, seem to do the same thing, where all forms of meditation are really ways of manipulating your attentional state, but some of them seem to have this same function of getting you out of the narrow planning focused track into just seeing what's going on around you. So I think there are things that it's the sort of stream of consciousness that you get, I think, in some kinds of psychoanalysis or brainstorming, seem to sort of put you back into that state. Now, all of those things in adults you can only do for a little while because, of course, you don't have a mama who's coming and making sure that you're fed and your diapers are changed and all the rest of it. So I think the secret for adults is to get a balance, especially adults who are in, as it were, childlike occupations like science and art, is to get a balance between the wideness and breadth of creativity and then the focus and discipline that you need to actually make things and finish things. It's always kind of embarrassing for me because I'm a cognitive scientist who studies learning, and then I get up and I lecture to my students. I do this medieval thing that literally dates from the time before there was printing, of getting up and giving my students a lecture. It's completely crazy. So one of the things, if I were the czar of undergraduate education, for instance, I'd turn it into an apprenticeship. I'd say, you know, what you should do is every faculty member should write a summary of what they're doing in layman's language, which is something that we should all be able to do anyway. And essentially, the undergrads should have 5 research apprenticeship courses. They should just pick, I'm going to pick 5 scholars who are doing something interesting, and I'm just going to hang out with them for, as they're doing whatever it is that they're doing, and be apprentices, do little bits and pieces that they think I'm capable of doing. And watch what they do. Find out, you know, what's it like to be a historical scholar? How do you deal with archives? What's it like in a lab when you've got a 3-year-old you're trying to study? I think that would be a much better way of doing undergraduate education. I have 3 who are now completely grown up, 30, 29, and 21. My baby is 6'3" and 225 pounds and has a shaved head and piercings and tattoos, and he's completely adorable, completely. He's the really, really sweet, adorable one. Nothing that I learned as a developmental psychologist was at all informative in terms of raising my own babies, because raising children is one of those, it's like, you know, swimming or rowing. It's an online skill. It's not something that you can do based on some theoretical analysis. And in fact, probably just like, you know, swimming, if you do too much theoretical analysis, you're not going to be able to do it as well. So on the other hand, my children certainly taught me a lot about philosophy and psychology. So being with my children and paying attention to them was enormously informative to me about what was interesting that was going on that I could find out about. But absolutely no help at all in terms of they came out fine, but no help at all in terms of actually raising them. I felt just the same pressure that all the rest of us, you know, damn middle-class parents in the 20th century feel, which was, it's a little tricky because one of the things I'd like to do in my next book is explain both philosophically and psychologically why that's so foolish, you know, the way that there's this very bizarre phenomenon, parenting, which has never existed in history before. The idea that there's this thing that you can learn how to do, which is to parent if you just get enough experts and technology to do it. For most of human history, you just were a parent. It's like imagining learning how to, you know, boyfriending, right? That's just a relationship you're in. But you know, that's what zeitgeists are like, in spite of the fact that I told myself that. I'm just as susceptible to, how are they coming out? Are they good? Are they not? Is it my fault? As everybody else is. As I say, now they're fine, so I can take credit for all the good things. Well, I think it's arguable that babies are literally at the core of what human love is all about, in 2 respects. We have some good evidence that the very fact that human beings pair bond, that's actually very unusual. So if you look at other primates, for example, even our closest relatives like chimpanzees, chimpanzees don't have this kind of male-female pair bonds that we do. They have a lot of social allegiances and alliances, and they have sex, but they don't have what ethologists call social monogamy. Social monogamy, here's the bad news. The bad news is social monogamy is never sexual monogamy. Even, you know, swans, when you do DNA analysis, it turns out that all animals have sex outside of their pair bonds. So for you young people out there, that's the bad news. But the good news is that in spite of that, we have pair bonds. We have close relationships between the people who are having sex and having children. And that's actually sort of unusual among primates, although it's quite common among birds, and it's common among other animals. And that seems to be associated with the fact that we have this extended period of immaturity. So the story seems to be the more investment there is in babies, the more work it takes to raise the babies, the more likely you are to have pair bonding, which kind of makes sense. So pair bonding is really a technique for getting lots of people involved in caregiving. And our babies, are like penguins. Penguin babies, they can't exist unless more than one person is taking care of them. They just can't keep going. So it's kind of interesting. I think in our case, we evolved to one of the most important evolutionary changes that led to our advanced intelligence and our creativity and tool use and all the rest of it is having this extended period of immaturity. But the extended period of immaturity depends on techniques that will have a lot of investment in babies. So the very fact even that we have love between partners, romantic love, I think is a kind of epiphenomenon of this more basic thing, which is the love we have as caregivers, the investment that we place in our babies. And if you think about that love, that kind of love, the love between caregivers and babies, much less written about than romantic love, it's a really extraordinary thing. It's, I say, imagine you had a novel where a woman found someone in the street who couldn't stand and couldn't wash and couldn't take care of himself. And the second that she saw him, she felt totally, completely, utterly in love with him. And then she dedicated her life to him for the next 15 years and did everything. I mean, literally, fed him and raised him and woke up in the middle of the night and tended him when he was ill. And then 15 years later, she said, go and find yourself a nice young woman to go and marry, right? You'd say, boy, that's creepy. That's love that's kind of so out there. It's, really weird, right? But of course, that's every single mother. That's exactly what we all do. That's our lives as mothers and fathers and great uncles and anybody who cares for a baby. That's what it's like. And in fact, I think if you look at some of the examples in the spiritual traditions about, the kind of love that bodhisattvas are supposed to feel, or saints are supposed to feel, or sadhikams are supposed to feel. An idea that you see a lot in religious traditions about, the kind of highest, or God is supposed to feel, the kind of highest form of spiritual love is this love that has this combination of utter particularity. So it's not just kind of abstractly, I love mankind. It's I love this person with that kind of intensity and utterly selfless, that I love this person so much that they're more important than I am. And bodhisattvas go around, allegedly, in the Buddhist tradition, loving every single sentient creature on earth that way. And I think the model for that is the way all us fallible, everyday, boring human beings feel about babies, and feel about the babies we take care of. And if we don't, there's something really terribly wrong. I mean, it's funny, I was thinking, I have my dearly beloved partner, and I think that I take pretty good care of him. But that means, I cook him dinner and we spend an hour or two talking in the evening. And then I let him alone all during the day. Well, that counts as being pretty good loving care for a partner. If I did that with a baby, I would be a hideously abusive mother. So even, a bad caregiver is already devoting care to this person that would be literally saintly if you were devoting it to anybody else. And you do it not knowing what this baby is going to be like. It doesn't depend on their particular features. You have no idea what the baby's going to be like. And we do it every day, routinely, without even thinking about it or paying much attention to it. So, one of the things I say is there are lots of ways to be saintly and love outside of having babies, but boy, having a baby's a good way to very quickly and efficiently experience a little bit of saintliness. There's actually quite a lot of interesting data about this. So if you look across animals, there's this distinction between R species and K species. And K species are the ones who have relatively few offspring, just a few babies, invest a lot in those offspring, and long period of immaturity for those offspring. And those are typically the most intelligent, flexible, learning-oriented animals. So if you compare, the great classic comparison is between crows and chickens. So, no moral things about primates and chimps and humans enter into this. Crows are amazingly smart birds, have abilities that challenge the cognitive abilities of primates. And they have a very long period of immaturity. Chickens are basically dumb as stumps. I mean, they're really, really good at doing things like pecking for grain and doing the things they have to, but they're not smart. And, you know, they're mature very quickly. And that seems to be a correlation that you see across many, many, many different animals. So, but I think part of what happens is that if you look at other animals, like I think if you look at wolves or hyenas, we're actually doing some work with wolves now. It's not that you don't see love. You see lots of social allegiances and social complexities. And in chimps, you see lots of social allegiances and complexities. But they have a kind of different character. So they're more like what happens in A Bunch of Friends. You know, so they're about how do you interact with a lot of other members of your species to get something done. That's something that primates do a lot. And primates are, I think that living as a chimp is a lot like kind of being in a Trollope or a Jane Austen novel where everybody's always saying, now where am I on the pecking order in comparison to everybody else who's on the pecking order? You know, what's the relationship between the baronets and the gentry? That's kind of like what I think life as a chimp is. So it's, you know, it's clear that chimps love and they have these, and chimp mothers clearly have very, very deep particular love for their babies. But I think it's very different from the way that creatures like us are oriented to love. Well, you know, banal, but 20% of American children growing up in poverty, yeah, that's pretty worrying. The fact that we invest nothing in children between the ages of 0 and 5, at least we have, you know, our public university at Berkeley is crumbling, but at least we have some investment in it. We do nothing for children between the ages of 0 and 5. And we seem to be quite happy to have children growing up in not just poverty, which wouldn't be so bad, but isolation, lack of people around them, lack of support, lack of ability to go out and play in the dirt. You know, those kinds of things. Yeah, that definitely has me worried late at night. Babies are very resilient. People are very resilient. We've managed to think of lots and lots of different ways of solving this fundamental human problem of raising children. But the fact that babies and mothers, you know, babies can't vote and mothers are too damn busy to vote, or at least be involved in politics, means that the thing that is, in important literal senses, the most important thing for human beings, which is raising our next generation, I think this is literally true, is something that is just out there on the margins of politics. And I think that's really problematic. I think the most problematic thing for me is that the two great passions, intellectual passions of my life are very hard-nosed analytic philosophy of mind and cognitive science on the one hand, which is what I started out doing. I was a philosopher and is still, in some important sense, where my deepest heart is. And children and babies on the other hand. And of course, that hard-nosed analytic philosophy of mind, philosophy in general, is totally dominated by men, has been a field that's even more dominated by men than, you know, theoretical physics is. And of course, anything to do with babies is completely associated with women. So it's been a real struggle. Part of, you know, half the time I thought to myself, well, come on, you don't want to be a woman whose career is devoted to doing all those, you know, womany things with kids and babies and all that girl stuff, right? And another part of me has, you know, you should really go and become the analytic philosopher and show that this is something that that women can do just as well. And the other part of me says, no, what you should be doing is showing that all that stuff that everybody, you know, treats with without much dignity, babies, children, they're actually telling us as much. If you pay attention to them, they're as deep and profound and is important and tell us as much about any of the things that we care about in analytic philosophy as the, you know, science and the things that analytic philosophers, guy philosophers, typically pay attention to. So the whole point of my career has been to try to take babies and young children who have been, I don't think it's too much of an exaggeration to say have been sort of intellectually treated with contempt over the years. When I was in graduate school, one of the Oxford philosophers, when I was talking about how children could explain about philosophy, turned to me and said, well, you know, one has seen children about, hasn't one? But one would never actually speak to one. And that's not totally out of the attitude that people have had towards babies and children. So what I've tried to do is take that world and show just how deep and profound and analytic and rigorous and intellectually serious it is. And that hasn't always been an easy road to hoe. But I'm glad that I actually tried to do both of those things and put both of those things together instead of just following one or the other.